Welcome to Wild West Hearts, where honor rides with every hoofbeat dust burns in your lungs and every tail smells of gunpowder.
The wind carried ash down the slope, gray flakes dancing between patches of scorched earth. Each gust brought the stench of burned flesh and timber, a smell no man forgets once it's found him. Samuel Holt tugged his weathered hat lower, as if it might shield him from the truth sprawled below. His dun-colored mare shifted nervously beneath him, nostrils flaring at the acrid scent of death. His hand unconsciously moved to the inner pocket of his worn leather vest, fingers brushing against the small tin photograph case he always kept close. The image inside, faded now from years of handling, showed a woman with eyes that still haunted his dreams. Martha, 7 years gone from fever, but the wound remained fresh. Beside the case rested another relic of his past, a tarnished silver star he'd surrendered when he'd realized justice and law weren't always the same thing. What used to be a Cherokee village lay in ruins. Blackened frames of lodges jutted from the earth like broken ribs of some great beast. Cook fires, once the heart of family circles, now transformed into funeral pyres, still smoldering. The silence felt wrong, a place that should have been alive with voices, children's laughter, the rhythm of daily work, now reduced to the soft crackle of wood surrendering to flame and the hollow moan of wind through empty spaces. Samuel's mouth set in a grim line. He'd known trouble was brewing, had heard the talk in town, seen the way the cavalry officers drank heavier these days, noticed how the land company men spoke of clearing the territory in voices too casual for the blood they meant to spill. But knowing and seeing were different beasts altogether. He should have turned back. No good would come from bearing witness here. The dead couldn't be helped, and the living would only bring him trouble. But then, through the oppressive blanket of quiet, he heard something. A cough, weak but deliberate. Then what might have been a voice. The sound pulled him forward like a fishhook set deep. Samuel dismounted, his boots sinking into soil darkened not just with ash but blood. The earth itself seemed to resist his weight, soft and yielding where it should have been firm. His spurs clinked softly as he moved between the ruins, following that sound to its source. Behind a charred support beam, collapsed and still warm to the touch, he found her. She sat with her back against what remained of a stone hearth, knees drawn up to her chest. Her buckskin dress was torn and stained dark across one side. Her face, high-cheeked and proud even in extremity, was streaked with soot and dried blood from a gash at her temple. Her hair hung in matted strands. Beneath the dirt and blood, her skin had the waxy pallor of someone walking the edge between living and dying. But it was her eyes that stopped Samuel cold, black as the spent ashes around them, yet burning with a ferocity that belied her broken body. Those eyes held no fear, only a terrible clarity. When she saw him, she moved with surprising speed. From somewhere she produced a broken spear, the shaft splintered halfway down, the stone point still wickedly sharp, and aimed it directly at his chest. Around her neck, Samuel noticed a small leather pouch strung on a cord, elaborately beaded in blue and white patterns. She clutched it briefly with her free hand, as if drawing strength from it, before returning her full attention to him. "Kill me," she rasped, her voice like dry leather cracking. Her ribs showed through rips in her dress, rising and falling with labored breath. "Or keep me, but choose now." Samuel stood perfectly still, feeling the point of her spear hovering inches from his heart, understanding that despite her weakness, she had strength enough to drive it home if she chose. In that moment, with ash still falling like gray snow around them, he recognized something in her that felt like looking in a mirror. The determination of someone who had already accepted death but refused to surrender to it. Samuel didn't answer her ultimatum. Words seemed inadequate against the backdrop of such devastation. Instead, he slowly knelt before her, keeping his movements deliberate, his hands visible. The woman's spear followed his descent, never wavering from its aim at his vitals. Her knuckles whitened around the shaft, but exhaustion trembled through her arm. With careful precision, he reached out, not for the weapon, but for her. She tensed, a cornered animal expecting the final blow. But Samuel simply slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her shoulders. He lifted her carefully, surprised at how little she weighed. A bundle of bones and fierce will wrapped in bloodied buckskin. She didn't resist the motion, but neither did she thank him for it. The spear clattered to the ground as her strength finally ebbed. But her eyes, those unflinching, obsidian eyes, said everything her voice didn't. She didn't care whether she lived or died, so long as he chose. So long as the decision wasn't another thing taken from her. Samuel carried her to his horse, the mare dancing sideways at the strange scent of smoke and blood. He shrugged out of his coat with awkward movements, trying not to jostle the woman, and wrapped the heavy canvas around her shoulders. It swallowed her frame, making her seem even smaller. With reverent care, he retrieved her fallen spear and tied it to his saddle, an acknowledgement of something he couldn't quite name. The ride back to his cabin was conducted in a silence broken only by the rhythmic creak of leather and the occasional snort from the horse. The woman sat before him in the saddle, her back rigid despite her injuries, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if memorizing every ridge and valley they passed. Samuel found himself hyper-aware of her breathing, shallow but steady, and the occasional involuntary shudder that passed through her body. As they crested the final ridge before his property, Samuel noticed a group of riders gathered by the crossroads a quarter-mile from his cabin. He tensed, recognizing several faces from town: Mercer the shopkeeper, Reed who ran the livery, and a few ranch hands from the big spread to the east. They'd been waiting, he realized. Word traveled fast, even in these empty spaces. "Hold on," he murmured, feeling the woman stiffen against him as she too spotted the men. He urged his horse off the main trail, taking a less direct route that would bring them to the cabin from the rear. The men had seen them, though. A shout went up, followed by the distant thunder of hooves as several riders broke away to intercept them. "Samuel, halt!" The call carried across the distance. "Stop right there!" Samuel leaned forward. "They won't catch us before we reach the cabin," he said, his lips close to her ear. "Once there, I can hold them off." She didn't respond except to grip the saddle horn tighter as he spurred the mare into a gallop. Behind them, the riders closed the distance. But Samuel knew these hills better than any townsman. He guided his horse through a narrow wash, up a steep embankment, and finally into the clearing where his cabin stood. By the time he'd helped the woman dismount and hustled her inside, the riders were still negotiating the difficult terrain. Samuel grabbed his rifle and took position by the window. The woman stood beside him, her spear at the ready despite her weakened state. "This isn't your fight," Samuel said. "It became my fight when you chose," she replied simply. Outside, the riders approached more cautiously now, spreading out in a loose semicircle before the cabin. Mercer rode slightly ahead of the others, his usually affable face set in hard lines. "Halt!" he called. "We got word about what happened at the Cherokee camp. They're saying you took one of them savages." Samuel didn't answer, just kept his rifle trained on the group. "The territorial marshal's been notified," another voice shouted. "They'll be here by tomorrow. Best you turn her over now, before this gets ugly." The woman's hand found Samuel's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "I can go with them," she said quietly. "Save yourself this trouble." "No," Samuel said, the single word carrying the weight of decision. "That's not how this works." He raised his voice to address the men outside. "This is my land. Anyone sets foot on it uninvited will be treated as a trespasser." The standoff stretched for long minutes, neither side willing to force the issue. Finally, Mercer spat into the dirt. "This ain't over, Holt," he called. "You're choosing wrong. Town's got a long memory." He wheeled his horse around. "We'll be back with the marshal." The group retreated slowly, casting dark glances over their shoulders. Samuel kept watch until they disappeared from view, then lowered his rifle with a heavy sigh. "They mean it," he said. "They'll be back." The woman moved away from the window, her face unreadable. "Everywhere the same," she murmured. "White men with fear in their hearts." Samuel set his rifle down. "I need to bring the horses in closer. Make some preparations." He gestured to the cabin. "This place can be defended, if it comes to that." She nodded once. "I will help." His cabin appeared as the afternoon light began to soften, a modest structure of rough-hewn logs nestled against the protective embrace of a rocky outcropping. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, evidence of the banked fire he'd left that morning. A small corral stood empty beside it, his other horses out to pasture. Inside, Samuel laid her carefully on a buffalo robe near the hearth. She tried to sit up immediately, her muscles tensing against invisible bonds, but failed, collapsing back with a hiss of frustration rather than pain. He stoked the fire in silence, added wood, and set a pot of coffee to boil. The domestic sounds seemed obscene against the memory of the destroyed village. But Samuel moved through the familiar motions, like a man clinging to solid ground in a flood. "You ain't my prisoner," he said at last, his voice rough from disuse. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. The woman's eyes found his, unflinching. "I ain't your wife." Each syllable distinct, a boundary drawn in sand. Samuel nodded once. "Didn't ask you to be." Their silence filled the room like smoke after that, thick enough to touch. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning around the eaves of the cabin with a sound like distant grief. Inside, two strangers circled each other with words unspoken, waiting to see which would draw first. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The woman didn't speak, not when Samuel changed the dressing on her temple wound, not when he left food beside her, not when he returned from tending his small herd of cattle. She ate little, pushing the food around her plate more than consuming it. At night, he'd hear her breathing change, knew she slept in fits and starts, plagued by dreams that sometimes pulled sounds from her throat that made his skin crawl. Samuel gave her space, sleeping on a bedroll by the door, while she took the buffalo robe by the hearth. He'd seen animals caught in traps before, knew that crowding them only made them gnaw their own limbs off in desperation. On the morning of the 4th day, he returned from checking his fence line to find her attempting to fetch water from the barrel outside. The movement had pulled her borrowed shirt, one of his, hanging loose on her frame, askew, revealing her back. Samuel stopped cold, his breath catching. Scars, not the usual marks of a hard life, but deliberate ones. Lash marks, old and silvery, cross-hatched her copper skin. A puckered bullet wound marked her right shoulder blade, and across her upper thigh, visible where her makeshift dress had ridden up, ran a deep, jagged blade mark that spoke of a wound that should have killed her. She sensed his presence and turned, water sloshing over the rim of the bucket she carried. For a moment, their eyes met in silent acknowledgement. He had seen, and she knew he had seen. Then she straightened her spine, lifted the bucket higher, and walked past him into the cabin, leaving wet footprints in the dust. That evening, as the setting sun painted the western sky in violent strokes of crimson and gold, Samuel spotted her by the corral. She sat cross-legged in the dirt, her broken spear across her lap, methodically working its stone point against a whetstone she must have found in his tool shed. Each stroke was precise, almost ritualistic. The sharp scrape of stone against stone carried clearly in the still evening air. Samuel approached slowly, making his footfalls deliberate so as not to startle her. When he reached the fence, he leaned against it, rolling a cigarette with practiced motions. "You planning to kill me with that?" he asked, nodding toward the spear. The question held no accusation, only a weary sort of curiosity. She didn't look up from her work, but her hands paused momentarily. "Not you," she said, her voice low and unused. "Someone else." Samuel struck a match against the fence post, the small flame illuminating the growing darkness between them. "Who?" he asked, exhaling smoke that mingled with the gathering evening mist. Only then did she look up, her gaze shifting toward the distant hills where the last light clung to the highest ridges. "White coats," she said simply. He knew what she meant without further explanation. Soldiers, raiders, slavers. Men with authority conferred by papers and government seals, or men who took authority through violence. Men who considered people like her, and sometimes people like him, obstacles to be removed from the path of progress. Samuel nodded once and took another drag from his cigarette. The ember glowed bright, then faded, like hope in dark times. That night, the sound of approaching horses woke them both. Not the casual approach of travelers, but the purposeful rhythm of men who'd come with intent. Samuel was on his feet before his mind fully registered the sound. Rifle in hand, powder horn already slung across his chest. The woman moved just as quickly, spear clutched in white-knuckled hands, her back pressed against the wall beside the single window. Samuel gestured for her to stay back as he edged toward the door. The approaching horses slowed, then stopped. The jingling of tack, the creak of saddle leather, the low murmur of male voices, 3, maybe 4 men. "Holt!" a voice called out, slick with false bonhomie. "Samuel Holt, you in there?" He recognized the voice. Ellis Thornton, a land baron from the territorial capital who'd been buying up homesteads across the county, by fair means when possible, by fouler ones when necessary. Samuel's jaw tightened. "What business you got riding up on a man's home after dark, Thornton?" he called back, not opening the door. "Just a friendly visit," came the reply, dripping with insincerity. "Got some papers I thought you might want to see. Sheriff Baines is with me." At the mention of the sheriff, Samuel's stomach knotted. Baines was Thornton's creature, bought and paid for with whiskey and promises of advancement. Where Thornton went, Baines followed, providing the veneer of law to whatever the land baron wanted. Samuel opened the door a crack, rifle clearly visible. In the yard stood three men, Thornton in his city clothes, looking incongruous against the wild backdrop of the foothills, Sheriff Baines, a flask already in hand despite the early hour, and a young man Samuel didn't recognize. Barely more than a boy with nervous hands that hovered too close to the shotgun strapped to his saddle. "What papers?" Samuel asked, not inviting them in. Thornton smiled, a gesture that never reached his eyes. "Land survey papers, Holt. Seems there's been some discrepancies in the property lines out this way. According to these new surveys, your southwest corner overlaps with a parcel recently purchased by my company." "I've had those boundaries marked for 12 years, Samuel said flatly. "Same as the man who had this place before me." Sheriff Baines took a long pull from his flask, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Documents don't lie, Holt." "Not like people do." His gaze drifted past Samuel into the dimly lit cabin. "Speaking of liars, heard you might be harboring someone." Samuel felt rather than saw the woman move behind him, a shift in the air like a storm gathering. "My business is my own, Sheriff," he replied, his voice dangerously soft. Baines grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Not when your business involves one of them Cherokee savages that was supposed to be cleared out." He spat into the dirt. "Word gets around, Holt. Tracks don't lie neither." "She's one of them," the sheriff sneered, his hand dropping to his pistol. "You're harboring a savage." "That makes you know better." Before Samuel could respond, the woman stepped around him and out onto the porch. Her spear was in her hand, and though she wore borrowed clothes too large for her frame, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. The moonlight silvered her features, casting her face into a mask that revealed nothing. "I'll leave," she said, her voice steady and clear in the night air. Samuel turned to her, something unspoken passing between them in that brief glance, a recognition, perhaps, of shared defiance. "You stay," the rancher said, his tone brooking no argument, and he cocked his rifle, the sound sharp and definitive in the tense silence. Thornton raised his hands in mock surrender, that false smile still fixed on his face. Now, Holt. No need for things to get uncivilized. We're just having a conversation about property lines." "My property," Samuel said, "ends at the barrel of this rifle. And everyone on this side of it is under my protection." He shifted his aim slightly, the barrel now pointed squarely at Thornton's chest. "You best ride out now, while that's still an option." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Baines cursed under his breath and backed toward his horse. The young man with them already had one foot in the stirrup, eager to be gone. Only Thornton maintained his composure, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "This isn't over, Holt," he said quietly. "The territory's changing. Men like you, lone wolves holding on to your little kingdoms, you're a dying breed." "Then I'll die with my boots on," Samuel replied, "and take plenty of company with me." The three men mounted and rode out, dust rising in their wake. Samuel watched until their silhouettes disappeared into the darkness, then slowly lowered his rifle. Beside him, the woman stood unmoving, her spear still clutched in her hand, her eyes fixed on the point where the riders had vanished. "They'll be back," she said. "Not a question." Samuel nodded. "Before dawn, likely." She turned to look at him then, her face unreadable in the moonlight. Why? He understood she wasn't asking why they would return, but why he had stood for her. A stranger, a complication, a danger to himself. Samuel had no answer that would make sense spoken aloud. Instead, he simply said, "Get inside. We've got preparations to make." As they stepped back into the cabin, he caught her studying the small photograph of Martha he kept on the rough-hewn shelf by his bed. The woman's fingers went to the beaded pouch at her neck, a mirror gesture of remembrance that needed no explanation between them. They came as the first gray light of dawn crept over the eastern ridges. 4 riders, approaching in a wide formation that spoke of military training. No pretense of friendly visits now. Guns drawn, faces set with purpose. Samuel watched them through a crack in the shutters, counting seconds, measuring distances. The woman stood by the door, spear held low but ready. She'd bound her hair back with a strip of leather, dressed in the clothes Samuel had given her, but somehow transformed them into something that looked like armor. In the pale dawn light, with war paint hastily applied from his fireplace, ashes streaked across her cheekbones, she looked like something ancient and terrible, a spirit of vengeance risen from the earth itself. "Stay inside," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I will meet them." Before he could protest, she slipped out the door and onto the porch. Samuel cursed under his breath and moved to the window, rifle at the ready. The riders slowed, clearly taken aback by the solitary figure confronting them. The woman stood centered on the porch, feet planted shoulder-width apart, spear held diagonally across her body. She said nothing, made no gesture of welcome or threat, simply waited, still as stone. The lead rider, the young man from the night before, Samuel realized with surprise, called out, "We've come for the woman! Hand her over and there won't be trouble." She answered with silence, only the slightest shift in her stance indicating she'd heard it all. "Last chance," or another rider shouted, "or we burn this place to the ground." Samuel tensed, finger hovering near the trigger. But still he waited, somehow understanding that this moment belonged to her, that she needed to meet this threat on her terms. The first rider spurred his horse forward with a shout. The woman moved like water, fluid, unstoppable. Her spear flashed in the early light as she stepped off the porch to meet the charge. The rider fired wildly, the shot going high as his horse reared. The spear found its mark with terrible precision, driving upward beneath his ribs. He tumbled from the saddle with a strangled cry, the spear momentarily trapped in his body. The second rider wheeled his mount, bringing his rifle to bear on the now unarmed woman. Without hesitation, she positioned herself directly between the rifle and the cabin door where Samuel stood. Her back straightened, chin lifted, a human shield offering herself for the man who had offered her sanctuary. The message in her stance was clear. To reach him, they would have to go through her first. Samuel's shot cracked through the morning stillness. Catching the man high in the chest, he toppled backward off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The third and fourth riders, seeing their companions fall in the space of heartbeats, wheeled their mounts and fled, dust rising in their wake. Samuel emerged from the cabin, rifle still at the ready, scanning the surroundings for hidden threats. The woman stood over the body of the first attacker, yanking her spear free with a single powerful motion. Blood ran down her left arm from a bullet graze, but she remained on her feet, breathing hard but steady. Samuel approached her cautiously, noting the distant, almost tranquil look in her eyes. He recognized it, the strange calm that sometimes comes after violence, when the body is still caught between fight and flight, when the mind hasn't yet processed what the hands have done. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. She looked down at her arm as if noticing the wound for the first time. "It's nothing," she replied, her voice oddly gentle compared to the violence they'd just enacted. Samuel holstered his rifle and took a step closer. "Still want me to choose?" he asked, echoing her first words to him, days and lifetimes ago. She didn't answer, just stood there in the strengthening morning light, her spear dripping red onto the thirsty earth, her body trembling not with fear, but with the aftermath of battle. Something passed between them then, unspoken but understood, a recognition that choices had already been made, by both of them, with every action taken and not taken. The bodies were buried before noon, far from the house, unmarked. Neither Samuel nor the woman spoke during the grim task. Words seemed superfluous in the face of death. Death they had caused, death they had survived. Again. By afternoon, a nervous peace had settled over the cabin. Samuel tended the woman's arm wound, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he cleaned and bandaged the bullet graze. She submitted to his ministrations without comment, her eyes focused on something distant, perhaps something only she could see. Later, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Samuel returned from checking his cattle to find her by the hearth. She knelt before the fire, feeding papers into the flames one by one. With a start, he recognized the documents, the land survey papers the sheriff had left behind in their hasty retreat. "That was your land title," he said from the doorway, watching as the official seals curled and blackened in the heat. She glanced up at him, then back to the fire. "The paper means nothing," she said. "Men like them make marks on paper and think it gives them ownership of the earth." She fed another sheet into the flames. "Paper burns. Land remains. Samuel moved further into the room, setting his hat on the table. Was never mine anyway, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. I only ever fought for what I could hold. His gaze traveled around the cabin, the simple furnishings, the weathered logs, the roof he'd rebuilt twice after winter storms. Hold it against weather, against wolves, against men. That's all any of us do? She dropped the last sheet into the fire, watching as it curled into ash. For a long moment she stared into the flames, her face illuminated by their flickering light, shadows dancing across the planes of her cheekbones. Then, without turning to look at him, "And me?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. "Can you hold me?" The question hung in the air between them, layered with meanings neither was ready to fully articulate. Samuel said nothing at first, struggling with words that had never come easily to him, especially not for matters of the heart or soul. Instead, he moved to where his coat hung by the door, the same coat he'd wrapped around her shoulders that first day, and brought it to her. With deliberate care, he draped it over her shoulders again, a gesture that answered her question more truthfully than words could have. Night fell hard in the foothills, the transition from dusk to darkness swift and absolute. They sat by the fire as the sky turned iron, then pitch, stars emerging like pinpricks in the fabric of heaven. Outside, an owl called 3 times, its voice plaintive in the vastness. Inside, shadows danced on log walls and 2 people sat in a silence that had somehow transformed from wary to comfortable. "You should know," she whispered suddenly, her voice startling in the quiet. "I killed my husband." Samuel remained still, but his attention sharpened, focused entirely on her. She stared into the fire, her face set in lines of old pain. "He sold us to soldiers," she continued. "My people. Our daughter." Her voice caught on the last word, a hairline fracture in her composure. "She died in the cart before we reached the fort. Too small, too weak for the journey. Her hands twisted in her lap, knuckles white. I couldn't even bury her properly." Samuel's jaw clenched, a muscle working along its line. He didn't speak, understanding that she needed to empty herself of these words, this poison she'd carried. "When we reached the fort, I took a knife from a sleeping guard. Cut my husband's throat while he slept." She said it without emotion, a simple statement of fact. "Then I ran. They hunted me for weeks. I found my mother's people, stayed with them until—" Her gesture encompassed everything that had happened. The village, the smoke, the destruction. The fire popped and hissed as a log settled. Outside, the night creatures had gone suddenly silent, as if holding their breath. "I don't need saving," she whispered, turning to look at him directly. "I need somewhere to stand. Somewhere to plant my feet and say no more." Samuel put his rifle down, laying it carefully on the floor beside him. The deliberate action spoke volumes. A man setting aside his defenses, his power. "Then stay," he said simply, "as long as you want." She shook her head, a single sharp movement. "No, not want, need." Her eyes held his, unflinching. "I need to belong to something that won't sell me. That won't trade me away when the price is right." The words hung between them, weighted with a history of betrayals neither had fully shared, but both understood. Samuel met her gaze fully, perhaps for the first time since he'd found her in the ashes of her village. In his eyes was a recognition of her pain, her strength, her fierce need for something to trust. "Then stay," he said again, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "You belong to me." He paused, then added the crucial words that transformed the statement from possession to covenant. "And I belong to you." She nodded. Just once. A treaty signed, a promise made. The night deepened around them, the fire burning low. Neither moved to add more wood, as if afraid to break the fragile peace they'd established. From somewhere in the darkness outside came the distant howl of a wolf. Lonely, questioning, unanswered. Finally, she reached for the leather cord around her neck and carefully removed the beaded pouch. With reverent movements, she opened it and withdrew a small square of fabric, elaborately embroidered with symbols in threads of blue, red, and gold. Despite the dirt and wear, the colors remained vibrant, a testament to skilled hands and careful preservation. "My grandmother's," she explained, seeing Samuel's questioning look. The last thing she gave me before the soldiers came. The patterns tell our family story, where we come from, who we belong to. Her fingers traced the intricate designs. When everything else was taken, this remained. She placed the fabric on the floor between them, a bridge across the distance that separated their worlds. Then she reached for the knife at Samuel's belt. He didn't flinch as she drew it, the blade catching firelight as she turned it in her hand. With deliberate precision, she carved a line across her palm, not deep, but enough to draw blood. Then she extended the knife to him, handle first. Samuel took it without hesitation and mirrored her action, drawing the blade across his own palm. The sharp sting was nothing compared to the weight of the moment. "Blood for blood," she said softly, extending her bleeding hand toward his. This time by choice. Their palms met, warm blood mingling. Neither looked away from the other's eyes, both understanding the ancient power of what they did. Older than paper deeds, older than governments or borders, older perhaps than words themselves. A covenant written in the only ink that truly mattered. Samuel didn't flinch at the sting, nor at the intimacy of the gesture. Something passed between them in that moment. Something beyond the physical connection of flesh and blood. A recognition, perhaps, that they were two broken pieces that somehow fit together. She leaned into his chest. Finally, after all of it. Her body softened against his, the tension she'd carried since he found her easing by degrees. Samuel's arms encircled her cautiously at first, then with growing certainty as she didn't pull away. Outside, the hills burned with sunset, the last light catching the highest ridges in a blaze of crimson before surrendering to the advancing night. Inside, silence held them like a vow. Not the tense, wary silence of strangers, but the comfortable quiet of people who had found in each other something they hadn't dared hope still existed. What's your name?" Samuel asked at last, his voice a low rumble she felt through his chest. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice carried the weight of decision, of choosing to share this last piece of herself. "Aida," she said. "It means worker in wood." Samuel nodded, committing the sound to memory. "Samuel Holt," he offered in return, though she hadn't asked. "I know," she replied, the ghost of a smile in her voice. "The sheriff called you that." They lapsed into silence again, but now it was a silence filled with possibility rather than dread. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Thornton would return with more men. The territory would continue its relentless march toward what men called civilization. The world would keep turning with all its cruelties intact. But tonight in this cabin on the edge of wilderness, two people had found something rare and precious. A choice freely made, a bond forged in blood and fire. Ida reached down and carefully folded her grandmother's fabric around their joined hands, binding them together with threads that connected past to present, death to life, her world to his. "Kill me or keep me," she had said. He chose both. He killed the past and kept her,